This is the story of one of British history's most crucial battles and how it was influenced by the terrain over which it was fought. The programme uses the latest animation techniques to explain how the line of fire affected the outcome of the battle, which won the freedom of a nation. The Battle of Bannockburn is a rare example of a single decisive action which not only decided the outcome of a campaign, but of a whole war. With his crushing victory over King Edward II's English army, the Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, won not just the field of Bannockburn, but the freedom of his country.
It's impossible to overstate the significance of the Battle of Bannockburn to Scottish history. It's one of these rare events where the outcome of not just a battle but also of a campaign and effectively a nation is decided in a single day.
It proved that Robert Bruce was not just a good guerrilla warrior, but he was able to speak the military language of the time. He was able to win a battle on a field.
It represents the greatest defeat of English arms by a Scottish army throughout the Middle Ages. But more importantly, it was the one conventional battle which Robert the Bruce had to win. And really, if the Scots had lost Bannockburn, then any chance for independence would probably have been lost.
Legend has it that Robert the Bruce drew inspiration from the determined efforts of a single spider. Such colourful folklore has endured, at least in part, because there are few surviving records from the time of Bannockburn. However, of those which do survive, two in particular are significant. The first, the Lanercost Chronicle, which was written by an Augustine friar at the Lanercost Priory near Carlisle, tells the story very vividly from the English point of view. The monk himself saw many of the events that day. On the Scots side, the most important source is The Bruce, a long poem by an Aberdonian monk called Barber, which also draws extensively on eyewitness accounts of the battle. The subject of the poem is the man who was then a claimant to the vacant throne of Scotland, the future King, Robert Bruce.
Robert the Bruce was one of 13 claimants for the throne of Scotland. At that time, the throne was in the gift of Edward I, and he was certainly in no hurry to appoint a successor. But the Bruce was one of those individuals who was not going to be thwarted, and he decided that he personally was going to fight his way through the throng of competitors by whatever means were necessary, and he was going to seize the throne of Scotland.
At first, Robert Bruce's loyalties were, to say the least, uncertain.
Robert the Bruce in himself is a much more ambivalent figure than Scottish patriotic myth suggests. As a young 20-year-old noble, he was actually fighting on the English side. He joins the Scottish rebellion under William Wallace and fought for a while, but then deserted it. Indeed, his wife, Elizabeth de Boon, was his prize for deserting the Scottish cause.
Robert the Bruce, therefore, was not, like William Wallace, committed to Scotland's independence from the very start. Robert the Bruce's family, the Bruce family, was very powerful in Galloway, the southwestern part of Scotland.
And they were closely tied to the English crown. Robert himself was born in England, and his personal wealth depended very much in the tradition of balancing his English commitments against his Scottish commitments in an effort to get as much power as possible in Scotland without offending the English crown and endangering his estates in England.
In fact, Bruce was still fighting with the English when they took Stirling Castle in 1305. But even as he fought for his English overlords, he was already plotting to overthrow them.
Edward I is one of the greatest kings ever to come from these islands. He was a warrior, he was a statesman, he was a very astute politician. He'd been on a crusade to the Holy Land, he had dealt with civil strife very firmly in England, and he'd subdued the Welsh. He was an all-round king at a time when a king needed to be personally, physically strong and decisive.
He was from the Plantagenet family, and people said that the Plantagenets were descended from the devil, and it was based on their having a fiery temper.
With the tragic death of Alexander III, Scotland was left without a clear heir to the throne, and the Scottish nobles actually they asked Edward I to adjudicate as to who had the best claim. This was really like inviting the fox into the chicken coop.
He took advantage of Scotland's period of weakness caused by the death of the king and the lack of an obvious heir to impose himself on Scotland as a superior overlord. There's no doubt he was a pretty ruthless medieval king, but also effective.
At the beginning of the year 1306, Bruce changed sides for the last time. His overriding ambition was to claim the vacant throne of Scotland, and to achieve this goal, he ruthlessly murdered John Comyn, his nearest remaining rival, in the chapel of Dumfries Abbey.
The deal was the two individuals, Bruce and Comyn, had been joint guardians. They hated one another's guts. There are accounts of them being at one another's throats. They never got on very well. And when Bruce decided to make his bid for the throne, we think inspired by the terrible death of William Wallace, because Wallace was executed in 1305, Bruce makes his bid in 1306. But what Bruce has to do is to buy off the possible opposition to his own bid in Scotland. Otherwise he's going to face civil war. So Comyn's one of the major players. He's a big noise in the Highlands of Scotland. So they decide to meet at Greyfriars Church. I think they were just meant to try and negotiate some kind of compromise, and they lost their tempers. And Bruce, in the heat of the moment, stabbed the Comyn near unto death, as they say. And the story is that he staggers out of the church and says to his faithful retainer, Kilpatrick, I think I've slain Comyn. And Kilpatrick says, I'll mak sicker, I'll make sure. He goes back in and finishes him off. It's the worst possible scenario for Bruce. He's automatically excommunicated because he's defiled the sanctuary. The worst thing you can do. He's also generated civil war with the supporters of John Comyn, the very thing he wanted to avoid. And worst of all, he's taken on the might of Edward I.
Although he was excommunicated for his crime, Bruce still had himself crowned King of Scots on Palm Sunday, 1306. Edward I received news of the events north of the border with anger and resolved to deal with the threat posed by the Bruce. But at 68, he was far too old and exhausted by long years of campaigning. Much against the advice of his household, Edward raised his army and once again marched north. However, his strength finally deserted him, and he died at Burr-on-Sands, 3 miles short of the border with Scotland. With the king dead, the invasion of Scotland was abandoned. Edward I would be a hard act to follow. Not only was the aptly named Hammer of the Scots a very experienced soldier, he was also a great statesman. His son, Edward II, was clearly a very different man to his father.
Edward II was entirely different to his father. Edward I was an extremely experienced soldier. He had campaigned in many different countries, France, Wales and Scotland. He was a tough old veteran who knew his business. His son, Edward II, was not interested in military campaigns. He was much more interested in the good life and really did not want to be troubled by such affairs.
He showed very poor judgment in who he favoured, and of course his favours were sometimes handed out on a sexual basis. His homosexuality was notorious, and his male favourites reaped many of the rewards his barons believed they should have.
Edward II certainly wasn't the man that his father was. But having said that, the modern view that he was an ineffective homosexual doesn't really seem, in my view, to be completely supported by the evidence. The king was a lover of art and literature. He was certainly a cultured man in an age where physical qualities were probably more important. But if you actually examine the historical record, the real facts are fairly scant to label a charge like that against him.
Robert the Bruce lost no time in capitalising on the weaknesses of the new English king, and slowly but surely he tightened his grip on Scotland. By the summer of 1314, he was undeniably King of Scots. The famous legend of the spider may well have played its part.
The legend of the spider is very famous in Scotland. Essentially, after the Battle of Methven in 1305, Bruce and his band of followers had been beaten comprehensively and scattered. When he entered a cave, hiding from the English, he brushed against a spider's web and sat down entirely despondent. But he noticed that the spider began to build his web again, and Robert the Bruce, probably out of malice or spite, brushed the spider again and then sat back down despondently. But the spider simply started to rebuild its web once again. And it is said that from this moment of entire despondency and gloom, Robert the Bruce took the message that he must try and try again, that as long as he had the willpower to continue the struggle against England, then he would eventually be successful.
The first reference to Bruce and the spider comes in Sir Walter Scott's Tales of a Grandfather, 1830. There's not a trace of it before that. There is a legend from the 17th century which associated a spider with the Black Douglas, Robert Bruce's famous sidekick, but no association between Bruce and the spider. What we have here is a great example of instant legend, or the invention of tradition.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Enjoy our rich library of documentaries covering key events and locations of the medieval period. History Hit's medieval offering features leading historians such as Dan Jones, Eleanor Janega and Kat Jarman. Not only that, but we've a rich library of audio documentaries covering every period of history through our network of podcasts. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
I don't think it's really important any longer whether there was an actual spider or whether it's an apocryphal story. It's a very inspiring and uplifting image that's quite universal of a man who, despite all the adversity, tries and tries again. And in real life, Bruce, despite having tremendous adversity in his personal life and in his political life, kept trying and trying and trying till he won in the end. So it's a very fitting legend.
One by one, the towns and castles of Scotland had been stormed by the Bruce. Now only one remained in English hands: Stirling Castle, the key to the kingdom. Although not as large as Edinburgh Castle, Stirling was strategically far more important. It dominated the central plain in the middle of Scotland, where most of the wealth and population was concentrated. Today, it is still a majestic and awe-inspiring sight. In the Middle Ages, it was a daunting fortress. For the Scots, the capture of Stirling Castle was of vital, symbolic and strategic importance. Unlike his warrior father, Edward II was no soldier, but even he recognised that if Stirling Castle fell back into the hands of the Scots, the war and the country was effectively lost.
Castles in general were very important strongholds for dominating an area militarily.
It gave you a place where you could rest, requisition your forces, build up your strength and sally out to attack the enemy. And it really meant that unless you'd captured all of the castles as well as the land around it, you really didn't have control of a captured country.
Determined to relieve the beleaguered English garrison, King Edward gathered an army about him and marched north. He was spurred on by the disturbing news that the governor of the castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender to the Scots if the garrison was not relieved by Midsummer's Day. Edward's march, therefore, became not only a show of military strength, but a race against time. Both sides were only too well aware of the importance of the coming encounter. The long, drawn-out struggle was about to be decided one way or another in a final, thunderous battle. At the heart of King Edward's army at Bannockburn were his household knights, a contingent of armoured cavalrymen permanently employed by him. In all, Edward mustered something approaching 3,000 heavy cavalrymen. Not all of them were knights, of course. Some were ordinary men-at-arms, but by comparison to the Scots, they were very well equipped.
The mounted knights were the heaviest component of the army. They were the equivalent of, in medieval terms, of the Panzer division. They were massively strong, where all the strength was concentrated, and they were intended as the shock troops. They relied upon their weight and the force of their impact.
More often than not, a charge of heavy chivalry will make infantry in front of it run away.
That meant that they were often used for the decisive blow on the battlefield, and even though they were sometimes unruly, their charge often decided the fate or outcome of a battle.
Accompanying the new king on his march north were 20,000 infantrymen. Many of these were raised from the Welsh marches, but the Irish Prince of Connaught was also requested to provide Irish spearmen to serve in the army.
While cavalry can mount a decisive blow, can shock an opponent and hopefully pursue him from the battlefield, infantry is and always has been the only arm of an army which can hold ground.
Infantry provided the flexible all-arms dimensions to break down the sorts of formations that might block heavy cavalry.
Once they'd been mustered for service, the foot soldiers were organised into units of 20 men, led by an officer called a vantanar, from the French word meaning 20. 5 of these units, or vantains, were grouped together into a company, led by a centenar. He rode on horseback, wearing full armour, and was often a professional soldier. There was no formal organisation of the army above the level of the company. Come the day of a battle, it was customary practice to organise the various companies into 3 great divisions or battles. The vanward, the mainward, and the rearward. It was the job of the marshal, the medieval equivalent of a chief of staff, to allocate the different companies to each division, taking care to ensure that all 3 had an even proportion of archers and spearmen. The infantry were, of course, much less heavily armed and equipped than the cavalry. Over their basic clothing of shirt, hose and doublet, foot soldiers commonly wore padded quilted jackets of canvas or leather, perhaps a mail, together with simple iron helmets. If they belonged to a lord's retinue or were in the direct pay of the king, they wore livery coats displaying their master's badge. Often the Red Cross of St. George was added to the coats of the infantry.
You can imagine when 2 armies finally became locked together in hand-to-hand combat, and this was in the days before uniforms had widely been accepted, it was very difficult to identify who was on your side and who wasn't. For that reason, a lord would issue liveried coats to his army. That helped to identify who was on your side and who was on the opposition side.
the Scots army could not have been more different from the English. The most important element of the Scots army was not the mounted knights, but the infantry, who were mainly armed with spears known as long pikes. The Scots combined their companies into much larger bodies of pikemen called schiltrons, a Scots term which quite literally means moving thickets. Each of these moving hedgehogs of pikes was about 3,000 strong. The men were densely packed, shoulder to shoulder, forming a forest of spear points, which posed a formidable obstacle to charging cavalry.
One man in a spear on a flat field against a man on a horse is going to die. But a group of men in a formation carrying spears is a much more formidable task. Indeed, horses will not actually go into such a formation, they will shy away from it.
Now, of course, such weapons were not new. Alexander's Macedonians had used very long pikes, as long as 20 foot long, back in ancient times. By Robert the Bruce's day, the Scottish spear or pike tended to be about 12 foot long, which made it a bit handier for individual combat, but still long enough to be used collectively.
The schiltrum, the idea of that was more of defensive, I think. It's been compared to a hedgehog, with a kind of semicircle and spears sticking out, close ranks and archers between the spears. The idea was the spears would protect the defending troops against a cavalry charge. The archers would do their damage as well. But it clearly didn't work at Falkirk. So in terms of effectiveness, I'm afraid the schiltrum perhaps is not that impressive at this particular juncture anyway.
They are not effective against archers. Archers can stand 16, 18, 20 feet from you even, further than you can hit with your pike, and they can shoot you with the bow.
Despite this, the Scots nobles shared these dangers with their men. While the English leaders rode with the cavalry, the Scots knights dismounted and fought in the front ranks of the schiltrons, shoulder to shoulder with their men. King Edward assembled his army at Berwick on the 10th of June 1314 and, travelling north by way of Edinburgh, reached Falkirk, barely 10 miles from Stirling, on the evening of the 22nd. The King of Scots was waiting for him. Unlike William Wallace at Stirling Bridge 17 years earlier, Bruce had chosen his battlefield with considerable care.
The Scots army had chosen some very favourable positions indeed for the Battle of Bannockburn. And it's quite rare in medieval warfare that they had actually had the time to choose their site and prepare for the battle.
The English army needed to approach Stirling Castle itself to relieve the siege that had been going on, as per their agreement. And the closer you get to Stirling and the valley of the River Forth, the worse the countryside gets for an army like the English.
Stirling was surrounded by a low floodplain known as a carse, a wet, marshy area quite unsuitable for cavalrymen. The old Roman road, however, followed a spine of slightly higher, dry ground. A couple of miles south of Stirling, the road crossed a narrow stream called the Bannockburn, and then ran over a low plateau with patches of woodland. This area had been reserved by the Scottish kings as a hunting ground and was called the New Park. It was obvious that King Edward's strategy would be to advance on Stirling along the Roman road. He had with him a huge baggage train which could not be dragged across open country. Bruce, therefore, deployed his army among the trees of the New Park, just north of the ford over the Bannockburn. Pots or pitfalls were dug across the front of this position, so that if the English cavalry tried to force their way up the road, they'd have not one but two difficult obstacles to negotiate before coming into contact with the Scots infantry. On the other hand, the flat carse to the east of the New Park was left invitingly empty. On Sunday, the 23rd of June, the English army cautiously felt its way forward to the Bannockburn, halting about half a mile to the south. At this point, Sir Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling, is said to have slipped out of the castle to advise King Edward that large bodies of Scots infantry had been seen moving amongst the trees of the new park. Bruce had in fact taken up a position of all-round defence in the park. As Edward advanced along the road from the south, he would soon discover the elaborate and perhaps rather obvious obstacles placed in his path.
But there was still the danger that while he held and protected the main high road to Stirling Castle, there was still the danger that the English might outflank him either to the left or the right. On the left, the King's Park made it less likely, and that meant that in some respects Bruce almost was anticipating or forcing the English to move to their right and into the much more boggy ground of the Bannockburn and Pellstream Burn.
King Edward began by sending 2 squadrons of cavalry forward to inspect the new park before committing himself. The first English reconnaissance party, led by the impetuous nephew of the Earl of Hereford, Sir Henry de Boon, advanced straight up the road, splashed across the ford over the Bannockburn, and began taking note of the Scots' defences. To his complete shock, he came face to face with the Bruce himself. He was quite alone. For young de Boon, this was an opportunity too good to miss, and taking up his lance, he rode straight at the Bruce.
Think of this from the point of view of Robert Bruce. You've gone out for a bit of a reconnaissance. You're not on a big expensive war horse, you're on a small horse. You're not wearing your heavy armor. And coming towards you, you see Henry de Boon. Huge guy, huge horse, a lot of armor, a lot of stuff on top of his helmet to make him look even bigger than he was. And he's thundering towards you at a hand gallop, as fast as he can make his horse go and still keep it under control. Tremendous momentum. He's got a lance, and it's pointed right at you. And Robert the Bruce sidesteps his pony, and he cuts Henry de Boon's head in half.
It certainly shows that Bruce was a veteran soldier, well able to defend himself and of great physical strength. He wasn't going to have any stripling of an English knight see him off at this most critical phase of the engagement.
Having said that, for a commander in the field to risk his person in such a way certainly is quite a rash move, because if Bruce had the worst of the fight against de Boon, the battle would have been over and the chances of Scottish independence would have been squashed there and then.
The episode ended when some Scots cavalry rather belatedly appeared at the Bruce's side to chase off de Boon's startled followers. The Bruce's only comment was to complain about the perfectly good battle axe which had been broken in the act of dispatching de Boon. Meanwhile, the second English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Robert de Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont, had run into real trouble. Crossing the Bannockburn further to the east, they had kept to open ground and were working their way around what appeared to be the open flank of the Scots' position, when a skiltron of pikemen suddenly rolled out of the woods towards them. As his pikemen came clear of the trees, their leader, the Earl of Moray, halted for a moment in order to give them time to close up their ranks. It was then that a furious argument broke out between the leaders of the English cavalry. A Yorkshire knight, Sir Thomas Grey, was in favour of charging the Scots immediately, while they were still in some disorder. But de Beaumont wanted to wait, confident that the more Scots who were allowed to come out of the trees, the more would be slain. Neither of the Englishmen had any doubts at all that they could overcome what appeared to be a rabble of unarmoured pikemen. Stung by de Beaumont's sneering, Grey lost his composure and rushed straight at the Scots and was killed at once by the pikemen. Other English knights soon followed him. Try as they might, the English knights could not break into the serried mass of pikes pressing towards them. In their frustration, some even flung their lances at the Scots like javelins. As the Scots resumed their advance from the woods, the English cavalry broke and fled in disorder, some to Stirling, others back to King Edward's camp. Having made their point in no uncertain terms, Murray's pikemen calmly marched back into the shade of the trees. The first round of the battle had undoubtedly gone to the Scots, but King Edward now knew that while a frontal assault straight up the Roman road would be fraught with danger, it might be possible to outflank the Scots' position by following Robert de Clifford's route. And so, that night, the entire English army ponderously swung around to its right, struggling across the Bannockburn to the east of the new park, and then waited uncomfortably for dawn.
The English army was exhausted. The horses needed water. They basically needed space to spread out into. And it seemed logical to the English to spread out into the triangle made by the Bannockburn and some of the minor streams, where there was enough flat ground to bivouac for the night and to water the horses.
What the English did not realise during that evening and then into the night was that they were essentially placing themselves in a trap where the streams and burns and indeed the River Forth would constrain their deployment the next day and give the Scots a great advantage to hem them into a position from which they would find it difficult to get out.
The Bruce seized his opportunity, and while the English army floundered in the mud and stagnant ponds, he swung his own army around, forming 3 of his schiltrons into a line ready to face the English at dawn. The schiltron on the right was commanded by the Bruce's brother, Edward, while the central schiltron came under the Earl of Moray. Sir James Douglas commanded the schiltron on the left. Meanwhile, the King's own schiltron formed a reserve. Unlike the English, the Scots had very few cavalry at Bannockburn. Most of the Scottish knights who were present fought on foot in the front rank of the pikemen. Bruce had at his disposal only 500 light horsemen led by Sir Robert Keith. These he placed well out on the left flank of the army, where they could guard against any sortie by the garrison of Stirling Castle.
Scotland had virtually nothing to match the heavy-mounted English chivalry. Now that's partly a comment on the number of wealthy Scottish nobles who actually were fighting with the English rather than the Scottish. What was used at Bannockburn seems to be roughly 500 much lighter horsemen who would have been equipped without the heavy plate metal armour that films like Braveheart have made so famous. More mobile, in many ways more flexible, but if forced to actually face a charge of English heavy cavalry, totally incapable of doing so.
There was one other element in the Scots army which was to play a crucial role. Hidden from the view of the English forces on nearby Coxted Hill were the camp followers and Highland auxiliary forces who had come to lend the Scots army help. They watched the proceedings intently and would later play a vital role as the events of the day unfolded. In stark contrast to the carefully laid plans of the Scots army, confusion now reigned among the English forces. There were, for instance, no recognisable divisions of the army, just 2 long lines, one drawn up behind the other. The front line was composed of 9 squadrons of cavalry, each one about 250 strong, while on the left of the line stood a much larger division of some 800 cavalrymen, which was rather optimistically called the vanguard. Behind this colourful array of cavalrymen, the English infantry were drawn up in a single, disorderly mass, hemmed in between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. At Falkirk in 1298, the wily old King Edward I had defeated the Scots under William Wallace by attacking and defeating each schiltron in turn. But the son was not the master tactician his father had been, and Edward II was now faced with a far more cunning adversary. Robert the Bruce's tactics at Bannockburn were very different from those adopted by Wallace. He would not wait to be attacked. The Scots would strike first. Before the attack, the Scots army fell to its knees in prayer for safe deliverance in the coming battle. Edward is said to have mistaken the Scots' prayer for a plea for mercy. Any doubts he may have had were about to be unceremoniously removed as Bruce formed his schiltrons into columns and advanced down the gentle slope from St Ninian's Kirk and the New Park, down towards the disorderly rabble which was the English army.
He knew how important it was to keep the English force penned into this small area and not allow them to deploy and spread out. So by attacking with his schiltrons, he certainly put the cat among the pigeons.
The decision that Bruce took to actually enact that offensive move quite clearly stunned the English. The idea that what they considered half-trained Scots peasants would actually take the battle to them was not in their minds.
Now, you could only give English knights one order. You couldn't tell them to wheel right and wheel left. You couldn't give them anything complicated. The one thing they knew how to do was charge. And when the Scottish army comes down out of the woods, down the hill and out onto the flat of Stirling Castle, the English knights did the only thing they were trained to do. They charged.
Time and time again, they hurled themselves at the Scots' pikes. None could break through. The Scots stood resolutely, concentrating on killing the horses, and as each mailed knight fell or kicked himself clear of his dying horse, he was quickly dispatched with swords or axes.
By advancing against the knights with his spearmen, the Bruce had drawn the sting from the English army. That was their main tactic, and once that advantage to charge home had gone, really Edward was on the back foot from then on.
Bannockburn was no elegant, chivalrous encounter. It was a muddy, brutal killing match in which no prisoners were taken and fine gentlemen were ruthlessly butchered by common soldiers.
This isn't the modern world. This was fought under completely different rules with a completely different set of values. Those who were injured or wounded in battle would be dispatched without any form of compassion. Your chances of surviving a wound were nil.
The mass of dead horses and dead men began to pile up. That made it more difficult for the second ranks of the English cavalry, and the Scots infantry during the battle, their cry was push on, to constantly constrain the English. And again, the image is really quite horrific. A struggling mass of men and horses being thrown from their horses by the Scottish infantry and then speared once they're on the ground.
Behind the embattled knights, the English infantry stood in frustration, unable to intervene in the struggle. From time to time, the archers amongst them tried to provide some assistance by shooting over the knights' heads in the hope of hitting the closely packed ranks of Scots pikemen on the other side of the melee. Unfortunately, they also succeeded in shooting many of their own men in the back, and they were soon ordered to stop. However, some archers managed to work their way around to the right of the English line, well clear of the fighting. From this position, they were able to shoot into the exposed flank of the Bruce's own schiltron, without fear of hitting their own men. As casualties among the pikemen mounted, Bruce called his own cavalry into battle.
Archers at that time would normally protect their position by digging in stakes into the ground that would protect them against cavalry, but because the archers had moved into position, there was the prospect of being able to disperse them with a quick cavalry charge, and the Bruce saw that opportunity and unleashed his cavalry at exactly the right moment.
The cavalry would be exposed to archery fire for a few minutes as they charged, but once they got in close, the English archers would not be able to defend themselves.
The archers were quickly scattered and cut down. The threat to the Scots' flank had been averted. The battle had now been raging for an hour, and all around it was going badly for the English. Even King Edward had to defend himself with his mace as hands pulled and tugged at his harness. The battle was at a crucial stage, and it was now that Bruce unleashed a tactical masterstroke. he called forward his last reserve. Legend has it that the men who now suddenly appeared with their makeshift banners on the top of Coxted Hill in the new park were just camp followers, a motley collection of grooms, cooks and sutlers. As English knights struggled to overcome the Scots pikemen, the Bruce chose the moment perfectly to call the poor folk forward.
The legend of the camp followers is another one of these tremendous romantic stories that surround the Battle of Bannockburn. We'll never know for sure. Were they the camp followers, or was this the Highland army which the Bruce had kept in reserve till the last moment? Some historians come down firmly on the side they were the Highland, what were known as the gillies, the men who were warriors in their own right, but not sufficiently disciplined to take their place in the schiltrons. The other school of thought argues it was the cooks, the camp followers, the families, the ordinary people of Scotland who'd gathered together to watch this battle and who made makeshift banners when they could see the tide turning against them and used these to give the impression to the English that a new army had joined in the battle. It's certainly a colourful and a powerful legend, and it's one really you can believe if you like, because we'll never have the evidence. We don't know, and we won't ever know, were they Highlanders, were they camp followers? Was it a mix of the two? You know, it's possible it could be any of those things.
And to be quite frank, the English army had already had enough. And all it took was the arrival of this supposedly fresh force for the English to decide that now was the time to seek safety.
Their dismay turned to horror as they realised that they were being driven backwards deeper into the bog. The Lanercost Chronicle graphically recalled the carnage. In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cumming, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas they'd earlier crossed a great ditch called the Bannockburn, into which the tide flows, and now wanted to recross it in confusion, many nobles and others fell into it with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many were never able to extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus, Bannockburn was spoken about for many years in English throats. Not all of the English knights turned to flee. In an act of futile courage, Sir Giles d'Argentine, an old crusader, fought his way through to King Edward's side, led him safely from the battlefield, and then, declaring, "I have never been accustomed to run," returned to the fight and certain death. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had won his battle. Although many Scots pikemen were killed, mainly by English arrows, only 2 Scottish knights, Sir William de Vipond and Sir Walter Ross, were slain. As for the defeated English, so many of them were killed in trying to flee across the Bannockburn that it was said to be possible to walk dry-shod over their corpses. The relentless pursuit and ruthless killing went on into the midsummer night.
Of course, there was no Geneva Convention in those days, and the ordinary infantry certainly couldn't expect any mercy. And don't forget, the English army is now stranded, miles from home, in the midst of very hostile country. The mounted men have some prospect of escape, but for the men on foot and for the camp followers with their baggage, there's absolutely no prospect in reality of being able to flee back to England.
Many factors had contributed to the Scots' victory at Bannockburn. The Bruce had chosen his ground wisely. While his pikemen were able to operate effectively on the muddy castland, it was totally unsuitable for the heavy English cavalry. Although his army was greatly outnumbered by the English, it was much better trained. King Edward's knights were brave but undisciplined, and as a result, their superior numbers became a handicap, not an advantage. Put simply, they got in each other's way. Worse still, there was no effective chain of command on the English side. King Edward himself fought bravely as an ordinary knight, while his officers wrangled and argued amongst themselves. Not only was Bruce able to control his army, he was also able to judge when best to commit his reserves to the fighting. In short, King Robert and his army won the Battle of Bannockburn because they deserved to.
Bannockburn was undoubtedly a colossal victory. There's no question about it. Probably the most spectacular victory in Scottish history. As such, it's never been forgotten by certain sections of the Scottish community. The Scottish National Party, for example, still holds annual rallies at Bannockburn. I suppose it's seen as a kind of a shrine of Scottish independence or whatever. But much more important in the longer term was Bruce's propaganda department. They wished, above all, to get Bruce's title recognised. So what the Scots did, the nobles, barons, freeholders and the community of the realm of Scotland, in 1320 they sent a letter to the Pope of the day, really asking the Pope to put pressure on the English king to recognise Bruce's title.
In the famous Declaration of Arbroath, the Bruce's part in the struggle is fulsomely acknowledged, but the declaration clearly states that if he had failed his people, they would instantly strive to expel him as our enemy and the betrayer of his own rights and ours, and we would choose another king to rule over us who would be equal to the task of defence.
That is the earliest statement of the contractual theory of monarchy in European history. They're saying the king is answerable to his subjects. The king is answerable to the laws in exactly the same way that the subjects are answerable to the laws. And what you have there is a massive breakthrough in constitutional terms. We all take these matters for granted now. The next section of the Declaration of Arbroath goes on to say, and this is quoted all over the place, but it's still got, it's very moving. For so long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. It is not for riches, nor for glory, nor for honours that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no honest man will lose, but with life itself. And if people later on say that Edward was the hammer of the Scots, I'm sorry, I can't accept it. I think the Scots responded to Edward, there's no question about that, but I think they hammered themselves into a nation.
450 years later, the great Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote his famous ballad Scots Wha Hae in honour of the victory at Bannockburn. It is still sung today.
Welcome to your gory bed, run to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle lour, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave, wha can fill a coward's grave, wha sae base as be a slave, let him turn and flee. Wha for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword will strongly draw. Free man stand or free man fall, let him follow me.